Let's look at an uncomfortable story, one where Jesus doesn't come out looking very good. In this morning's scripture, we see Jesus encounter the Canaanite woman, called the Syrophoenician woman in Mark's Gospel, begging for Jesus to heal her daughter. At first, he ignores her. She persists, and the disciples ask him to send her away. When she kneels at his feet and can't be ignored any longer, Jesus says to her, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Helping you would be like taking the children's food and throwing it to the dogs. Wow. I told you that this is not an easy passage to look at because Jesus does not look good in it. It is not the Jesus that I know. This can't be the same Jesus we sing about. He looks so mean and uncompassionate. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. He said that. Don't skim over it. Let it sink in. There are many commentators who would try to justify Jesus' actions. They'll say that he had a mission to the Jews first, and then he wasn't really being mean, that this is all done as a lesson. God sent him to preach first to his own community, and then later the gospel message would be spread out to the Gentile world. The Canaanite woman was intruding on God's timeline. She was supposed to wait. Or perhaps this was about teaching her and us about persistence. You gotta keep pushing, keep bugging, keep asking. Jesus has a lesson about that elsewhere when he talks about the persistent widow who nagged an evil judge into doing the right thing. Maybe this is just another example of that. Or maybe he was just testing her faith, wanting to make sure that she really, really believed Jesus could heal her daughter. Could those be explanations? We want to excuse Jesus. I want to excuse Jesus. I want an easier way to explain this away. To say, I know it looks rude, but it's not because, or I know it looks like prejudice, but it's not because. Unfortunately, I don't have a way of explaining this away. We can't brush past it. We need to look at it and allow ourselves to feel uncomfortable. The power of this passage comes when you sit uncomfortably with it and really look at it. Jesus was a Jewish male born into a society with a lot of strong prejudices against foreigners and women, especially Canaanites. Canaanite was a catch-all term for a variety of indigenous ethnic groups to Canaan and Palestine. They were the people that the Israelites fought against when they came to claim the promised land. There's a long history of fighting and hostility here, a point that the gospel writer of Matthew is pointing out when he names her a Canaanite woman, instead of saying the more specific and contemporary term of Syrophoenician woman like Mark does. Matthew is reminding us of the cultural animosity that exists between Jews and Canaanites. You could draw some comparisons with our own indigenous and European settler communities in modern times. I think the way that this woman is ignored sounds very familiar to us. This is also a strongly patriarchal society where women had no voice. Jesus grew up in this culture. Jesus was part of that culture. When the Canaanite woman calls him, Jesus at first ignores. It was a polite way of saying no. The disciples are more rude and demand that he sends her away. Jesus doesn't, and the woman escalates the issue. She falls at his feet, refusing to let him go. This is when Jesus makes the comment about the dogs. It is harsh and uncaring. But it's not an uncommon metaphor. People of Jesus' day believed that they were the children of God, and everyone else was just something less. These were the attitudes that he was raised with. It was what he was taught. Did he share those attitudes? But he's God, you say. He would know better. Well, yeah, he's fully God, but he is also fully human. Not part God, part human, but fully human. And you can't be fully human if you're separate and untouched by society. When Jesus was a baby, he really was a baby and needed to be cared for. He didn't come out of the womb speaking full sentences and expounding theological doctrine. He had to be taught language. And by simply learning a language, you absorb the perspectives and idiosyncrasies of that language and culture. Jesus had to be taught, and he was taught by a faulty human society full of idiosyncrasies and prejudices. He learned the same prejudiced attitudes that everyone else learned. This is an uncomfortable truth. Jesus was fully human. Maybe we feel a little too human. But he was also God. And this story is also the moment we see that divinity on full display. The woman challenges Jesus. She says, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's tables." In other words, you are treating me less than a dog. She confronts him and exposes his prejudice. She makes Jesus look at an uncomfortable truth. And here, the Son of God does not look away, does not defend, does not argue or excuse himself, does not walk away. He sees her, sees that his attitude was wrong, and he changes his mind. He changes his mind. This is what is so radically shocking about the whole passage. Jesus was raised with certain prejudices he probably wasn't even aware of. But when those prejudices are confronted, he changes his mind. This is divinity. This is the Son of God. The rest of us, we'd probably have sent the woman away. We would have been defensive, would have argued. It's hard to hear that you've been wrong, especially when it's an opinion you grew up with. If you believed something, your parents believed it, their parents believed it, then it must be right. It's almost impossible for us to change such deeply rooted opinions, except by the grace of God, except for the Son of God. The miracles here is not just that the daughter is healed, but that Jesus saw the prejudice of his society and he changed his mind. Over the course of this summer, I've been raising the topic of racism from time to time, in part because our current moderator of the Presbyterian Church is Reverend Mary Fontaine, an Indigenous woman, but also because I was involved with a special committee to address racism. Racism is prevalent in all of our churches, just as it is in the rest of our society. It's hard to name and call out because the moment we do, we hear objections. Some don't believe it really happens and they want to see proof. Some say it used to be a problem, but now we've moved on. We get defensive and dismissive and don't want to hear about it. Racism and prejudice persists, mostly because we don't want to see it. It's an uncomfortable truth to look at. When someone challenges us and points it out, we're like the disciples saying, send her away. We try to distance ourselves. When confronted more directly, when the problem of racism is kneeling in front of us and we can't escape it, then we want to argue, to excuse ourselves. We want to say that we're not racist, that they misunderstood, that it's not a real problem. But if we look at someone when they're telling us that they're hurt and we argue with them, then we have failed to be like Christ. Like Jesus, we need to be willing to hear the other. And when our prejudice is pointed out to us, we need to be open to changing our mind. So Jesus is guilty of having prejudices. But does that mean he's guilty of sin? In my opinion, no. Sin is different. While prejudices and racism is a product of a sinful world, it is not a sin to grow up with prejudices. In our faulty society, prejudice is unavoidable. It can be safely assumed that all of us have prejudices that we're probably not even aware of. We might be saying or doing things now that is harmful to others, but we're oblivious to it. That's not sin. It is unfortunate, it's regrettable, but we haven't been sinful yet. I think of the elderly people I grew up with who used to say the word Oriental. They would see my last name and say, "Why, you've got an Oriental name." Oriental is not necessarily a derogatory term, but it's also not pleasant. It's othering, it's icky. You wouldn't say it today. But there was a time when it was considered just another way of saying Asian. Our family used Oriental to describe ourselves. You can think of a lot of other terms like this that have evolved over time, things that were once normal to say but inappropriate now. I'm not going to list any of that for you, but you get the point. It's not sinful or bad to have used an older term. The sin comes when we are asked to change the term and we refuse. When we know that we shouldn't say it, but we say it anyways, that's evil. Sin happens when we see someone in pain, when they tell us their stories of harm, and we refuse to change our prejudiced opinions. We all grow up with prejudices that we don't even realize we have. This is not sin. If someone confronts you on it or challenges you, you don't need to be defensive. You're not an idiot or a bigot simply because you have the same faulty assumptions and opinions that the rest of society has. You're just human. So no need to be fighting back. Instead, listen. When we hear stories of racism today, we need to truly hear it. We need to look at our neighbor in the eyes and be moved by compassion. We need to be willing to change our opinions. This is the moment when we are tested. This is the moment we prove ourselves to be followers of Christ. When we see our neighbor in pain, when we see uncomfortable truths and don't look away, when we are willing to change our behaviors and our hearts, then we are truly followers of Christ. May our churches be places where uncomfortable truths are spoken, where uncomfortable truths are heard, and where our own lives are changed because of it. Amen.